Hello, everyone. Before getting into today's story, I just wanted to say thank you for helping me reach over 100 subscribers. As a new YouTuber, this is very exciting for me, and I'm extremely grateful for all of your support. If you are not yet subscribed, and you enjoy the content of this channel, please consider subscribing. And if you have requests for any stories you'd like me to read in future videos, be they true stories, creepypastas, classic stories, or otherwise, please let me know in the comments. Thank you, and enjoy the story. Someone without a head parked his car outside my parents' house. I say without a head, but I can't be certain. I'm just telling you what I thought I saw. Not long ago, I returned to campus from Thanksgiving break and am writing this while sitting at my desk in my dorm. It's late and I've shut the blinds to the window in front of me. The only light in the room is from my computer screen. They say writing is the best therapy. Being an English major who often is overburdened by his own thoughts and frequently finds solace in writing, I'm inclined to believe this. So here I am, typing away. I'm not returning home for Christmas. My parents think I'm being ridiculous, but I've asked them to come visit me here instead. You're about to find out why. My parents live atop a mountain in a secluded wooded area of North Carolina, near a stream. They're both in their 60s. They had me later on in life and are getting ready to retire. They moved to this house recently because they wanted to divorce themselves from the world and find a house to die in peacefully one day. This house was perfect for their purposes. The driveway was long and winding, going all the way down the mountain. The whole way down there sat no other houses or structures of any kind, save for the occasional derelict barn. This was my first time at their new place, and they asked if I'd like to help them with the Thanksgiving grocery shopping. We were supposed to host a big family gathering in the house in the next few days. I told my parents I'd much rather stay home with my book. I was reading The Legend of Sleepy Hollow out of one of those thick anthologies you need for your major classes as someone studying English. I planned to write my final essay for American literature about the story, and this was my third or fourth time going over it. I felt I had everything I needed to write the paper. At this point, I was just reading it again for my own enjoyment. I told my parents I needed to get to work on my paper, though. Finding themselves unable to object to me doing my homework, my parents bid me goodbye and soon were on their way down the mountain while I was left alone. It was rather early when they left, no later than 2 in the afternoon, if that. But they warned it might take a while, as we had a lot of guests coming and needed a lot of food. I had nothing to do but continue enjoying Sleepy Hollow, and maybe start on the paper if I felt like it. I still had plenty of time before it was due at the end of the semester. My car was in the shop that day, so I couldn't really leave if I wanted to. This was fine by me, though. I sat on the living room sofa, all cozy with my favorite story. After finishing a paragraph, I'd look up and gaze out the large window at the natural beauty. I'd drawn the curtains so I could take it all in. I could see that the spacious front yard was empty and peaceful. That is, until an unfamiliar car came rolling up, seemingly out of nowhere. I frowned. I squinted with confusion, watching the car crawl to a halt almost directly in front of the window. Though it was the middle of the afternoon, the car's headlights shone bright. I am not an encyclopedia when it comes to car makes and models, but in its shape, the car vaguely resembled a hearse, and was completely black and elongated. It looked quite old, and like it was well traveled, being splattered with dried mud, and seemingly coated in dust. The windows were completely blacked out. I couldn't see who was inside. I slowly set my book down on the sofa. The first thing I did was lock the front door. Then I walked to the kitchen and locked the back door. I came back to the living room to look out the window, and I saw the car still sitting there in the driveway, its engine humming softly. I started to think of all the possibilities of who it could be. My first thought was that it was some lost food delivery person. Then I wondered if it was one of my parents' friends. They were always private about their social lives, so I knew none of them. Or even someone who got the date of the Thanksgiving gathering wrong. I admit I know none of my extended family. But no one got out of the car. It seemed almost as if no one was inside, and the car had driven itself here. I stared at it for several more moments. For perhaps 10 minutes or more, the car just sat there, the engine still running. I briefly thought about going out to confront whoever it was, but I felt vulnerable in my meager frame. The heaviest thing I ever lifted was probably a copy of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. I then thought to call my parents and ask if they were expecting anyone, but something told me I was in immediate danger, and I decided to go ahead and call the police. Now, up in the mountains, you get terrible if any cell phone reception, so you had to rely on landlines. When I told the 911 operator about the car, she asked me my location. She seemed surprised by the address. "You sure that's where you're at?" the 911 operator asked. "There hasn't been any property sold out there in decades." "Well, my parents got a good deal on a house out there," I said, frustrated. "I bet they did," remarked the voice on the other end of the phone. "I don't know who in their right mind would build a house out there." "Yeah, well, someone did, and it was on the market." "I'm sorry, sweetie," the operator said. She could sense I was annoyed, I think. "The police are on the way. I hope they don't get lost. It can be tough to navigate that trail with all those dead ends and twists and turns." I hadn't even thought about that. I began to grow worried. I looked out the living room window. The car still sat there, engine and lights still on. It had been, I believe, roughly half an hour since it arrived, or a little past that. "Is he doing anything?" the woman on the phone asked me. I shook my head and answered, "No, he's just sitting there." "Well," the woman said reasonably, "it's a quiet area up there. We haven't had any calls from there in..." "Well, I can't recall. Maybe we've never had any. There might not be too much reason to worry just yet. Just be sure to keep an eye on him." "I will," I promised. "The police are roughly 15 minutes away. Do you want to stay on the line with me? Is he still just sitting there?" "He is," I informed her. Suddenly, I didn't feel so afraid. I found myself wanting to inspect the car more closely, see if I could possibly see anyone inside. I don't know why, but I suddenly had an image in my head of some poor old man who collapsed dead at the wheel after putting the car in park. It seemed like the only explanation. It was approaching 45 minutes since the car pulled up, and still, no one had emerged. "They're nearly there," the woman on the phone told me, talking about the police. "Yeah," I said, nodding. "I think I'm okay to wait on him. He's still just sitting there." "You sure, sweetie?" "Very," I said, and because I sounded so calm, she seemed convinced it was safe to hang up, though she did so reluctantly. I decided I would walk outside and investigate, now confident whoever was in the car couldn't harm me. Every guy in their late teens or early 20s thinks he can handle anything, and I was no exception in that moment, scrawny as I was. I watched the car out the window as I moved slowly toward the door, and then, out of nowhere, the car door was steadily pushed open from the inside, and someone at last emerged. I froze. The man in the car was certainly not dead, nor even injured, and he wasn't old at all, or maybe he was. He had no facial features to give me any indication. He was very tall, and wearing boots which he seemed to struggle to stand upright in. His bulky, broad frame was covered in antique-looking garb. I swear, it seemed like he was wearing the coat of a Revolutionary War soldier, brassy buttons and all. A long, dark purple cape fell down his back and nearly touched the ground. Either he was wearing a headpiece from some Halloween costume to make him look headless, or he actually had no head. I only saw a brief glimpse of him, but I swear on my life it looked very much like the latter. He began marching toward the window. He was unsteadying his boots, but he was still moving swiftly enough to get me to dash into the kitchen and out the back door. I couldn't hide. He'd already seen me. Hadn't he? He seemed headless, but he didn't seem blind, and he looked huge enough to crush me to death with his bare hands. Hardly thinking, I sprinted down the slope behind the house. I was tripping over myself and nearly tumbled all the way down, but I finally made it to the bottom of the hill on which the house sat. I kept running, flying down the mountain. I barely knew where I was going, but I knew I'd eventually run into the stream, and after crossing a bridge that ran over the stream, I'd be safely on the path into town. I couldn't hear the sound of police sirens anywhere. The fuckers probably got lost or stuck trying to navigate the mountain. I did hear the sound of a car, though, and it was amplifying as I continued to run. Looking behind my shoulder, I saw it. The black hearse-like car was following me. Engine roaring lion-like, the car tumbled down the slope behind the house and was racing toward me rapidly as I continued downward along the winding path. I bolted. It seemed impossible the old car could go as fast as it was. It was quickly gaining on me. The sound of its roaring engine and its wheels crashing through the ground's autumn leaves and over rocks and twigs grew louder and louder. I kept sprinting toward the bridge. It eventually came into sight, but was still far away. The stream was sparkling in the afternoon sun. Deer and rabbits fled as I sped past. I remembered the story. I remembered Sleepy Hollow. How could I forget? I read it so many times I knew it by heart. The only way I'd be safe is if I believed the Hessian trooper, the headless horseman himself, was the one chasing me. Trying to get with the times, he traded in his horse for a car, one that was due for a replacement, but still had a few good miles on her and was still good enough for chasing unsuspecting victims. No, he wasn't Brom Bones or any other prankster. He was the real deal. The ghost of some unfortunate Revolutionary War soldier who lost his head to a cannonball blast. He wasn't some creature from Celtic folklore brought over into American mythology by one Washington Irving. Fuck no, he wasn't. He was a real ghost in a real ghost car, and he'd moved on from Sleepy Hollow to terrorize all other corners of the American wilderness he claimed as his own. I had to believe it. I simply had to. Otherwise, he wouldn't disappear when I crossed the bridge, as the story promised he would. I found my feet hitting against wood. Thank fuck I had finally made it. I was crossing over the stream. The bridge didn't seem wide or sturdy enough to accommodate a car, but I couldn't be certain. He'd vanish regardless. He just had to. He didn't. As soon as my feet were back crunching leaves and sending dirt flying behind me, I heard the sound of tires rolling fiercely against the wood of the bridge. He'll vanish, I assured myself, screaming it in my head. He won't make it over. I don't think he did. Though I was relatively far away, I could clearly hear what I thought was the sound of the bridge collapsing before he could make it over, and the car falling into the stream. Maybe it was the noise of something else, or I'd just come to the bottom of the long pathway that led up to my parents' house. The sounds of the town, busy with holiday preparations, were now audible. Maybe a tree had fallen into the nearby lake. Maybe there was a car crash a few blocks away. I can't be certain. I didn't look back as the car was crossing the bridge. Apparently the bridge is still intact according to the police and was never damaged. At least, that's what they tell me. My parents dropped the bags of groceries they were about to load into their car when they saw me in the grocery store parking lot, approaching them wide-eyed, red-faced, out of breath, and drenched in sweat. I told them the story and they were initially alarmed. but have since come to suspect I imagined most, if not all, of the encounter, being I was an imaginative lit nerd. The police had indeed made it to the house, arriving shortly after I made a run for it after seeing the headless man. They found tire tracks, they said, that suggested someone had indeed driven up to the house. However, they claimed they couldn't find any evidence that someone had driven after me down the mountain. I protested, saying I clearly saw the strange car driving down the slope behind the house and heard it racing toward me as I ran. There were indeed tire tracks out behind the house, but my dad reminded me that when my cousins who lived nearby came to visit, they often drove behind the house and down the slope to go fishing at the stream, and had even done so recently. The police accepted this explanation, but cautioned my dad that driving down the slope could be dangerous. He agreed and promised my cousins would never do it again. So, who was he? The headless horseman of American folklore? A random prankster? My mom's explanation is that it was my Uncle Phil, who mentioned offhand that he might come to help prepare Thanksgiving dinner that day. She pointed out that the figure had trouble walking and that Phil was recovering from a twisted ankle. Maybe that was it. Or maybe someone had stuffed those boots with paper or crushed cans or something to make himself appear taller and more menacing, and had some trouble walking as a result. Why someone would want to scare me, I have no idea, if indeed it was a Brom Bones-like prankster I had encountered. Mom at least conceded Uncle Phil doesn't have that kind of sadistic sense of humor. Then again, maybe I wasn't the intended target of the prank. Maybe the previous residents were. My parents had just moved in after all. Maybe the prankster didn't know his targets had changed their address. Just maybe. I do know one thing for sure, though. Whether in my mind or really out there on the road, I still see that strange black car every now and then since the encounter. It sped past me, it seemed, on my way back to campus. It sat parked near me when I went out on a Walmart run. It seemed to follow close behind me, the driver invisible behind the blacked-out windshield, as I was returning home to my dorm tonight, before it vanished just as I turned into the campus gates. And now, as I look up from my screen, I can see the bright shine of headlights through the window blinds, getting closer and closer and closer.